Hello, hello. It's Chris here. It's been a pretty cold, rainy day, but the sun is peeking out now. But it just happens to be the time that I've allotted to discussing Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. But before we get too much into the meat and potatoes of this book, we're going to sing a verse from a song. The line it is drawn, the curse it is cast. The slow one now will later be fast, as the present now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading, and the first one now will later be last, for the times they are a-changin'. Now, why did I pick this song? I felt like this verse, the last verse in Bob Dylan's "The Times They Are a-Changing," it's an appropriate song for this book, Midnight's Children, because there is a sense of being within history, lost within history, figuring yourself out within history, and acknowledging that you're at the thralls of history as well. Now, Midnight's Children was written by Salman Rushdie. It was published in the 1980s. I can't remember the date exactly. But Rushdie won the Booker Prize, which is a very prestigious English literary award. And he actually won the Booker Prize, we can call it, the Turbo Booker Prize. So basically the best Booker Prize out of the last 25 years. Recently, it was awarded to Rushdie's Midnight's Children. Now, Rushdie is an Indian English author. He grew up for most of his life in India, but he moved to England when he was a young man. Now, this book, Midnight's Children, going into it, I was aware that it was magical realism. That is the main draw, that Rushdie is incorporating the main genre. So I was expecting something on the similar lines of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, whose 100 Years of Solitude I had mixed feelings of. I felt like I was enchanted and spellbound for the first 100 pages. However, when I took a break from that book, I struggled to get back into it. I think I struggled because the book itself doesn't have as much of a plot. It's just kind of characters and stuff that happens, magical stuff that happens. And there's supposed to be an over-encompassing theme or idea to the work. However, I felt like it didn't really land and stick with me. And I was starting to feel similar qualms with Rushdie's Midnight's Children, because although the writing is quite vibrant, and he adds so many interesting, there's so much color in his writing that there's many things I'm sure that I've missed just by the fact that I'm not aware and privy to that part of the world. The book does take place in India, also in Pakistan, but predominantly really India. And there are many words, phrases, and habits of the people that I don't understand quite as much. But this was a interesting insight into it. I did feel like the characters, to be a bit more general regarding the writing, I did feel like it was a bit of a mix between Marquez, but there was a very, very evident Dickens influence in Rushdie's writing. And I think that's in many facets through the characterization. However, I didn't feel like Rushdie's characters were as lively and well-etched as Dickens is. They kind of just appear, they're really, really intense, and they kind of fade away. It was very hard for me to really grab onto anything too much in this story, very much, for the most part, for the first 2/3 of the story, I would say. It was hard for me to grab onto something. The characters, they're quite absurd, many of them, but sometimes they can feel a little bit trite, a little bit just extreme. But what is Midnight's Children about? It's about essentially the story of Salim Sinai. He's our first person narrator. It's clear he's going through some stuff. We're constantly wondering whether he's mentally there. And he writes in a certain way that makes him not exactly antagonistic towards the readers, but he definitely goads the readers and doesn't give the readers a really easy time sometimes. Often using humor, he will play quite a lot of tricks on the readers, Salim Sinai. And you wonder if this is really Rushdie himself, his writing style. Obviously, Rushdie created Salim Sinai, but I seem to have a difficulty perhaps separating Salim Sinai from Rushdie. Although Salim Sinai, the character, has a different life story than Rushdie's, albeit very similar. But it does remind me of Gabriel Garcia Marquez in that environments, there's a sort of magic to environments, not just people, but also objects and things are imbued with magical powers that aren't really well explained in the story. At least Salim Sinai doesn't necessarily feel the need to completely explain everything. However, he asserts that this very well might be true, but he's telling a story as well. He asserts that. And because he's telling a story, there might be some holes in it. One of the slip-ups is when Salim Sinai admits that he got Gandhi's date wrong. So Midnight's Children, it concerns the events of essentially Salim Sinai's grandparents all the way up to his when Salim Sinai is an adult. So we can safely assume that this is about a little bit under 100 years, maybe 80 years, 60 years of time that's going through this story. And yes, there's not a lot of plot, and that becomes quite evident early. It's kind of, each chapter is its own little event, essentially important event in Salim's life. And the first part of the book, the first 150 pages, don't even concern Salim himself. They concern his grandfather and his father, and his grandmother and his mother. They concern their lives and how they led up to Salim's birth. And Salim, as I mentioned, is a bit of an intrusive narrator. He comes in, the present time comes in, then he goes back to the past very often. We can look at this book as a sort of, people have mentioned it being India's declaration of literary independence. I'd be a bit hesitant to do that in a way, because this is a book about India from a British Indian, very much written for a Western crowd, I would say. This is, even with all its Indiacisms in it, that Indian flavor in it, it's very much a British book, I feel. However, as the story progresses, a different picture starts to emerge, and the fact that there is no plot, something else emerges that's much more profound within the story. And this is what caused me to not completely give up on this story, and I actually quite enjoyed it at the end. And essentially, this story is about difficulties in finding ourselves in history and placing ourselves in the ever-flowing rivers of time, how do we define ourselves within these large, colossal, transnational events? And Salim Sinai's family essentially gets displaced, and he also feels the effects of these large-scale global conflicts and how they're pulling him one way and another, and very much impacting his life. So then we look at this story, Midnight's Children, and we see that it is very much a story about trauma. Trauma and finding ourselves in history, storytelling and magic, using magical realism, essentially describing things magically as a defense to the world and our helplessness to history. There are many occurrences within the story that have us question whether Salim truly has these magical powers. Because Salim Sinai was born on midnight, him and many other Indian children, he was born on the midnight of India's independence, the Declaration of India's independence. He is imbued with magical powers, him and these other Midnight's children. However, as the story progresses, we question really the truth, the veracity as to whether Salim really does have these magical powers. Because Salim apparently is he has telepathy. He's telepathic. And it's sometimes hard to prove that tangibly in a story sometimes, because you can say, yes, I saw so-and-so do this and this person do that and this person was thinking that. But is there any tangible, concrete evidence? There are tons of people throughout the world who have claimed telepathy. So as the story progresses, one does wonder whether this self-asserted magic that Salim has is really just a defense mechanism for what has happened in his life. Salim also cannot escape his heredity. So once again, spoilers in the story as always, but Salim Sinai, Salman Rushdie pulls really a sleight of hand within the first third of the book, and the characters that are described are not actually Salim Sinai's biological parents. They're just the parents that are going to raise him, and they don't know themselves that he is not their biological child. But it turns out that Salim's biological child is actually a British man who essentially, right as India gains independence, he has to leave India, and he's never heard of again in the story. This is quite interesting because Salim does become a canvas for India itself. India in itself being also not able to shake the heredity in the past of the British Raj. And I think that's a very pertinent point to make, and I would hazard that many Indians would admit that. Now, the Indian-Pakistan War is an incredibly important event that happens, and has happened for Indian history, and it still continues to happen. And it's a very important event in this book, much more important than I anticipated. In fact, I didn't really think about it when I was about to start this book. I didn't anticipate it. And I guess the kind of cyclical nature of these conflicts is also something that Rushdie proposes within these stories. Food are also an important element in heritage and in people, in maintaining an identity. Overall, this story, I've spoiled quite a bit of it, but it has an amazing aspect in that it really changes its flavor throughout the end, and it really affects how the rest can be looked at. That being said, I do stand on what I what I said in regards to, I didn't feel the characters as vibrant as perhaps a Dickens. I think Dickens is just the master in this. No shade to Rushdie, but the characters do seem to flow away like leaves. Very few of them stick throughout the narrative. And you don't really see them interact. You don't really see their personalities as much through their interactions. There aren't really many solid interactions with certain characters. It's just ones in which Salim Sinai, who from very early on we are given the impression that he's not a very reliable narrator. Because he's an unreliable narrator, it's difficult to give incredibly well-etched perceptions of these characters. And that's just something that is a bit of an aesthetic comment and tendency that I'd much prefer perhaps in this story. A character that's a little bit more that I can kind of cling on to, because I really struggle to cling on to things for the first half of this book. Women are depicted very much as oppressive, as kind of large and taking over. There are many, many muscular women within this narrative as well. But that is essentially why I chose Bob Dylan's "The Times They Are A-Changing." I think it's a very relevant song. At least I thought about that song just as I was finishing the book. I would recommend Midnight's Children. It's a very, very big, beefy book. As mentioned previously, the first half I was not really enjoying it that much. However, as I got to it, there is something that you can cling on to that is really quite interesting, I feel. And it really adds to, I wouldn't say the literature is necessarily as much Indian literature, although it can be characterized as that, but it's very much an international, transnational type of literature. Literature about how global events can impact people and how people are in need to create stories about their lives to essentially rewrite and understand how and why these things happened. That's very much what Midnight's Children is about. Now, this sounds like a very, very sad story, and it actually is, for the most part, a sad story. However, Rushdie never shies from using a lot of humor. There's humor brimming throughout all the pages, which adds to his quality as a writer, because even with all the humor in all the pages, this is still quite a sad story, in my opinion. That being said, that's Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. Hope you guys enjoyed. Take care.